Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
You've heard the headlines, and now many are seeing red dye number 3 to be exact. The food coloring, also known as erythrosine, is used to make products like candy, baked goods, and beverages look more attractive with its vibrant red hue. But recently, the FDA banned the synthetic dye from being used in foods and oral medications in the United States. And if you're like me, you probably started taking a really close look at all those nutritional and ingredient labels to see if what you are buying is one of these so-called offenders. But how bad is it? How does it compare to other dyes that we ingest, and why ban it now? On top of all of that, why is there a discrepancy between what the United States is doing versus Canada and other places around the world? I'm Melanie Ng, and this is The Big Story. Today, we explore the world of synthetic food dyes and what it may or may not be doing to our bodies. Joining us is Dr. Emma Allen-Vercoe, professor and Canada Research Chair with the Department of Molecular and Cellular Biology at the University of Guelph. Yeah, easy for me to say. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All right. In the headlines, we've heard anything and everything about red dye number 3. Let's get right to the beginning. What is red dye number 3, and why is there such a concern around it?
Sure. Well, red dye number 3 is one of a number of artificial food colors that are permitted for use in Canada, in foods in Canada, as well as drugs. Red dye number 3 specifically is not called red dye number 3 in Canada. It's called erythrosine. And that actually, I think it comes from the Greek for red or something like that. But it's basically a very brightly sort of pinkish red colored, like watermelon red colored dye that is based on iodine, actually, or it has an iodine kind of moiety to it. And it's still permitted for use in Canada. It is not very commonly used, interestingly enough. There are other red dyes which are much more commonly used in food and drugs in Canada. But it is one that's, as you've seen, the FDA in the United States has now decided to ban.
What's interesting, though, is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, there isn't necessarily new research that has been added. I believe the same. They're looking at the same research that we've seen for decades, but it was banned in cosmetics in 1990. But it was okay for and topical medications that was taken out, but for some reason, in the food and beverage industry and oral medication, it stayed. Why would there be a discrepancy there?
Yeah, so it's actually a really interesting and very long story that's probably going to bore very many people. So I'm not going to go into it. Suffice it to say that really what happened was more of a legal challenge to a ruling that from using a legal mechanism that doesn't exist in Canada, but basically saying that if a food additive has shown any effects on causing cancer in animals, then it must be banned. It must be removed from the food supply. And in the case of FD&C number 3 or erythrosine, the data is based on some very old, it's not that old, but getting there, data that was a study that was done in rats. And in rats, what they did is they loaded up the rats with this erythrosine, and then they looked to see what would happen. And in male rats, there was a particular propensity. And remember, they were giving a lot of red dye to these animals, right, much more than you would see in food. But that there was a particular propensity for a very rare type of thyroid cancer. And the interesting thing here is that the thyroid cancer in these male rats is actually caused through a mechanism which is a hormonal mechanism that doesn't exist in humans. And so the actual risk to humans was considered to be very negligible. And so the confusion here is, why then has it taken this long for a ban to take place? And as I said, that's to do with a legal sort of mechanism that's very specific in the USA. It's called the Delaney Clause, which was basically triggered, brought to the table for review by the FDA by a consumer group that felt very strongly that this needed to be removed from food.
Got it. And so again, this mechanism does not exist in Canada. Hence, there was a lot of noise with, is Health Canada going to follow suit? Are we going to take this dye off the shelves? Health Canada very clearly said no. They cited 2018. They reviewed an evaluation of this dye as a food additive, and they said at this point doesn't necessarily pose a health risk to the general population. I want to backtrack really quickly for you, or with you, I should say. When they basically load up these animals with these high doses, and as you said, a rat or whatever, it would react differently than a human. Do we ever truly know what's happening then? Because you can't be doing this sort of testing on human samples.
Right. And that is one of the arguments that I have for why do we put artificial food dyes into our food in the first place? Because, to truly know whether they're safe or not, then we really do need to test them in humans. And of course, that's not an ethical thing to do. Now, you could argue that, well, these food dyes have been in the food supply for long enough now that we haven't really seen a large number of cases of cancer, let's say, associated with them. But those kinds of studies are very, very difficult to do and very difficult to control for. And when you're talking about a population of people who all eat different things at different rates, it would be a logistical nightmare, as well as probably quite statistically incredibly difficult to sort out. And so I don't, we can't do those sorts of things. And so so it becomes a real problem, and on the one hand, we have the public now associating FD&C number 3 with cancer. And on the other hand, they're not necessarily in possession of all the facts of what went in. And Health Canada is quite right. They did do a very, there was a review in 2018 that really looked at these compounds quite in depth, and came to the conclusion that they didn't pose a risk. And remember that in Canada, the dyes are actually regulated for the amounts that can be put into food. And so the kinds of amounts that we're talking about, and the fact that this dye is not commonly used, probably means that this isn't necessarily a concern when considering cancer specifically.
A lot of people I spoke with say, okay, so let's use me as an example. I'm a 42-year-old woman who likely has been consuming this synthetic dye my entire life, and some of the candies and some of the frostings and whatever this might be. And there's a lot of concern because people, again, are just seeing the headlines. Could there have been any cumulative damage done in my health throughout those years? Or is this, again, unclear because there's not enough evidence?
Yeah, now that's again a very, very difficult thing to sort out. And let me try to break it down for you. So my specialist subject, if you like, I'm a microbiologist. So you might be thinking, what is a microbiologist doing looking at food dyes? I'm very interested specifically in the microbes that live in the human gut. And these microbes, as I tell my students, microbes have been around on this planet for billions of years, longer than we have. They've actually come up with some very sophisticated biochemistry. They're very good at breaking down molecules that our own human bodies can't break down at all. And so that means that when you inject a rat with this material, their rat body is going to see this this material and do what a rat body can do, but you're not necessarily looking at what their microbes, their microbiomes might do. My concern comes from the fact that we're eating all these foods that contain these artificial food dyes, and very, very few of them have been tested for their effects on the gut microbiome. And what's interesting about that, now I haven't worked on FD&C number 3 or erythrocyan, but I have worked on other food dyes, and specifically azo food dyes, which are much more commonly used in Canada and the US. Actually, there's a couple which have we can use 4 in Canada. There's a permitted use for 4 from Health Canada, but 2 of them I think are of concern. One is called tartrazine, and the other one is called Allura Red. My colleagues at McMaster have done some work on Allura Red that suggests that it's not necessarily the red dye itself, because it's also red. Allura Red is not necessarily that red dye itself that's causing the problem, but it's the molecules that are made after the bacteria digest it. And And again, humans don't break it down. They don't digest it. They don't make the products that the microbes do. Microbes can actually very easily break it down. And when they do that, they make other molecules. And my concern has always been that these other molecules have not been tested for their effects on health. And so, and that's the same for tartrazine. And so I really feel that although Health Canada is quite right in that these chemicals have been tested as far as possible in known studies, toxicology, we haven't really done a full breadth study yet. And I think until we start looking at the gut microbiome and the effects of that, we haven't done that yet.
I know you have done the work, and you've just had some published material specifically to these food dyes. But when you look at someone's gut microbiome, we vary from individual to individual as well. So does that also come into play with allergies, just the way our body basically processes things? It would be very difficult to have a control group, would it not?
Very, very much. And actually, you hit the nail on the head. This is the very, very difficult part of all of this is that, as you say, everyone has a different gut microbiome. Everyone varies. And so if you were to take a room full of 100 people and give them all tartrazine, some people's microbiomes might break that down quicker than others. Some people may not break it down at all. And we think that this actually might be behind the reason why, many studies have been done on tartrazine and its connection to hyperactivity, for example, in children. There's been a concern about that for many decades. But the science, when it is done, hasn't really proven it one way or another. And this could be why, because when you take children and you expose them to these things, you're not looking at the same child, you're looking at different children and different microbiomes. And so that wasn't appreciated at the time that these studies were done. So to me, there's, this extra dimension that we've completely ignored to this point that we perhaps should pay attention to, because it does turn out to be very important. And I think that the key thing in all of this is that what we're talking about here is artificial food dyes. And artificial food dyes are not there for any nutritional reason whatsoever in the food. They're there to make it look pretty. It doesn't add anything to the flavor, to the taste or the mouthfeel. It just makes the food look pretty. And so to me, the equation, the risk equation is not quite there. If we are not 100% certain that these products or that these dyes actually cause no harm, then perhaps we would be better off just not adding it to food in the first place. And there are alternatives. There are food-based dyes, natural food-based dyes that can be used as an alternative. These are often used in the EU, for example, where the azo dyes have been heavily restricted for many years. So it can be done. It feels like a little bit of a consumer thing going on here.
Right. So there's the difference, right? Because we've heard about beet juice, pomegranate juice as a replacement to the red, but somehow, somewhere along the lines, as you've noted, the red becomes attractive, right? We see the bright. And, as a small child, if you could choose between, let's say, a brown lollipop or a bright red lollipop, you're going for that red one. And we've been sort of programmed that way. What we need to do, if I'm getting this right, is we need to reprogram, because it's not that it's adding anything other than that bright color. Do we really need it? Which is really interesting, because even as an adult, I would be drawn to the bright color as well. But then it becomes the other question of, will it change the makeup of a food in any way if you're switching out different food dyes? I guess that's a kind of a weird question. But if you're let's say you're swapping out for beet juice instead of this red dye number 3, does that change the product at the end of the day?
Well, it changes its chemical composition, yes. It doesn't change its nutritional value. It doesn't change its taste, and it doesn't change its mouthfeel. So there's the crux of the issue. And actually, what you just mentioned about, as a child, if you were presented with a brown lollipop or a bright red lollipop, you go with a bright red lollipop. there is the problem that we face. And that is something that I think is very specific to North America. And let me just backtrack there. You can tell from my accent, I wasn't brought up here. I was brought up in the UK. In the UK, food colors have been, heavily regulated for many, many years. Certainly when I was a child, they were used. They still are used, but they are not as, prevalent. When I was a child, I was just not exposed to these colors. It's difficult for me to put my finger on it. I didn't realize at the time because, I wasn't missing them. It was when I came to Canada some, 25 years ago, then I kind of started looking at candy and thinking, what is wrong with this candy? It's so bright. And to me, it looks fake. And I think that's a very key thing to remember is that you form your food preferences very early in life. As you said, when you're a child, if you start to associate bright colored foods with delicious things like candy, those food preferences are formed early in life and they stay with you for the rest of your life. And so perhaps we shouldn't be exposing children to these colors. As I said, to me, they look fake. It's unappealing to me. And so I don't think it's something that we can't undo. I think it's something that we need to really think when we've got small children, particularly, do we need to expose them to these brightly colored foods, especially when there are alternatives?
Is there any research right now that looks at the effect on children versus an older population and how any of the synthetic dyes or any processed foods of that matter, how they vary and affect different parts of the population?
Yeah, so we are particularly concerned about children in terms of again, the food azo dyes and FDC number 3 probably fit in the same area because these foods that are colored with these azo dyes or these artificial colors are usually things like candies, soft drinks, frostings, jellies, the kinds of things that children and young adults are drawn to.
The good stuff.
The good stuff that everyone, yes, exactly. And the issue here is that although Health Canada regulates how much of this material can be added to food, it doesn't regulate how much a certain person can eat. You could have, you can eat a whole cake and all its frosting, and you would probably get quite a lot. You could drink liters of Gatorade. That would be a problem. And so we really need to start thinking about how much we consume and about the issues of marketing these kinds of heavily processed foods to that demographic. I think that's part of the issue. And again, if it's not that I have anything against processed food personally, I don't like it, and I wish that we could remove a lot of them from the food supply, but they're not going away. So I think too many people like them. But I think that there are ways to limit the amount of potential problems that we have with them. And one of them is really looking at some of these artificial additives, and not just the colors. There's a lot of work going on now on other artificial additives and the effects that these might have on the gut microbiome in particular, which has, as I said, been ignored to pretty much until recently.
Has any of your work or research or any of that of your colleagues made its way into the hands of Health Canada, or have they consulted with you or any colleagues about what can be done? Because in an ideal world, as you noted, it'd be great to have a big, better study, more research that is thorough, that we really take a look at what is happening within our bodies. Do you know if anything like that could be in the works? I know it should be in the works, but is it? Where are we with our standards?
Yeah, very tough, and I feel for Health Canada, they're in a tight spot here. To do those kinds of big studies takes a big budget, and the money for research is always been very hard to come by and is getting harder and harder to come by. So there's always going to be fallback onto the studies that have already been done. Certainly, the food industry would want us to, not delve too deeply, because it makes a lot of sense for them to keep using these artificial products because it's cheaper for them to do so. So I'm not sure that necessarily it's Health Canada that needs to galvanize the researchers to do the research. That needs to come maybe from Health Canada, but perhaps also from consumer groups. And certainly we need the money behind it to do those kinds of studies. And these are not cheap studies that we're talking about. So very kind of tricky to do, very difficult to do well. It's not because there's a lack of scientists who would do them, because I'm sure we all would, but it's just, as I said, very expensive to do these kinds of studies.
For any of our listeners, if you were to give them 3 pieces of advice when it comes to synthetic food dyes or processed foods, whatever, all the like, what would you say the 3 things are to be aware of and what they should do?
Yeah, well, let's see. So the first thing I would say is you need to be aware of everything that you eat. And so something that I have trained myself to do over the years, and I haven't always done this, but I've certainly done it for the last since I've been studying the human microbiome, is to really read the labels on food. And I avoid pretty much all processed foods. Sometimes it's processed. There's ultra processed and there's processed. If you just like press the oil out of an olive, then that's processed, right? So it's just difficult to sort of know what we mean by that. But I'm talking more about the higher end, the ultra processed foods, where really what we've done is we've taken food, we've ground it down into its base chemicals, and then we've recombined it to make something else, right? Those are not healthy. And I don't think anyone could argue that they are. They're usually poorly nutritious. Usually they can be very cheap, and that's also because they can be made in industrial quantities. And that's usually a draw as well. But perhaps they're not the best thing that you could do.
Right.
And so the first thing that I would do, if you're really worried about food dyes, for example, even just looking on a label, looking for the word color. I think these days we see the actual names of the colors. And as I said, in Canada, FD&C number 3 would be called erythrocyan. And then you would look for things like Allura red and sunset yellow and all of those kinds of things. When you see those colors, then perhaps that food, if it's had to be colored, then that it's probably been pretty much processed before it's made it into its wrapper into your house. And so I do not partake of things. I'm very careful about that. It does take some practice. You do need to look at food labels. It takes the first time you do that in a grocery store, you'd be there for a long time.
You just live in the grocery store, yeah.
That's right. But after a while, it becomes second nature. You get to know which are the brands which you can trust. Now, the unfortunate thing about that is that the brands which do not contain these artificial dyes tend to be the more expensive ones, and of course, that's all of our pockets are being hit very hard recently. So we like to hear about that. I do think that there are some stories, Kraft Dinner, for example, has used to have tartrazine in it, no longer does. The reason for that is nothing else other than consumer pressure. So if consumers do not want this stuff, the food industry will sit up and take notice. But I don't think the pressure is going to come from regulatory bodies.
Got it. I do love my Kraft Dinner, and I was paying very close attention to that very story because there was something about this orange hue that maybe didn't sit well with me, but I did like the taste. So paying very close attention to those labels, looking for the word color, that's something really interesting. I don't think that would go through someone's head, but also making some noise, as you said.
That's right. Don't just
sit back and accept it as is. It's a tough challenge, as you said, because people are looking for cost effectiveness in this, in 2025. And so it's a tough balance. But if we can be more aware, then this is always good things. I'm going to leave you with one last question. They always say to trust your gut, listen to your gut. If your gut could tell our listeners one thing on the way out, what is your gut saying?
Okay. Your gut, or you have to think of yourself as the guardian of your microbes in your gut, right? Your microbes in your gut do a lot of work for you in terms of your metabolism. They do a lot of things for us that we're only really just beginning to discover. The more we look, the more we realize just how important they are to our health. And so therefore, because they live within us, you can think of ourselves as the guardian. The microbes in your gut can only eat what you eat. Right? They cannot, digest things that you're not giving them. And so if you feed them a steady diet of food dyes and additives, that is not potentially very good for them. What they really need to, what they would really say, if you could hear them, would be, please feed us more fiber. I think we've heard that a lot in the past. Why do we need to eat more fiber? It's because your gut microbes need it in order to make these beneficial metabolites that our health that requires. They need to eat mostly fiber. Fiber is usually the key there. So if they would scream for that, they would probably ask you to stop overeating. I think that's another issue. That you don't necessarily need to be snacking at all times of the day. And, there's so a lot of research has been done on the benefits of fasting, for example. We don't quite know how the microbiome plays into that, but it's a really interesting story that I'm following. But generally speaking, I just think that, you need to listen to your gut. If you are not feeling 100% well because of perhaps something that you've eaten, it's probably because your microbes are having to make do with some subpar nutrient that it's that's sort of digesting and making something else from that is making you feel not so great. So just always remember that you are the one that controls your microbiome's destiny. And so therefore feeding your microbiome well is the number one thing that you can do to protect its health and therefore your own health.
I wish we had more time. Dr. Emma Allen-Vercoe with the University of Guelph, thank you so much for joining today.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
That was The Big Story. You can send us feedback on this episode or any other episode by emailing us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca. You can also find us on the Seeker app on all your favorite podcast players as well. Make sure you rate, review, follow, and share. I'm Melanie Ng. Thank you for listening.